Okay, thank you for waiting, everyone. And can everyone hear me clearly? Okay, that's good. Okay, hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for joining Zoom Room B for co-sheltering lessons from emergency management session. My name's Hae-Yoon Sung, a graduate student from the Animal Studies MA program at New York University. Today, I'm here as a volunteer for My Dog is My Home's conference planning committee, and I'll be today's a moderator for this session. And I'm very pleased to help facilitate this conversation. Okay, so when looking at which disciplines have the longest history of discussing and practicing the sheltering of people and animals together in circumstances of homelessness, some of the most robust conversations have taken place in emergency management. Even before Hurricane Katrina, the notion of pet-friendly shelters and pet-related risk factors for evacuations are found in the emergency management academic literature. But it does seem that Katrina and a small white dog by the name of Snowball galvanized the public and policymakers. So it all starts back in 2005, in the days and months surrounding Hurricane Katrina's devastation of the Gulf Coast. A little boy and his dog Snowball made headlines and became a symbol of the heartache, separation, and loss of life when the human-animal bond was ignored in the disaster's response. As people were being evacuated from the New Orleans Superdome, AP reporter Mary Foster was present to witness and write about the moment where a little boy lost his dog. She wrote, "At the back end of the line, people were jammed against police barricades in the rain. Refugees passed out and had to be lifted hand over hand overhead to medics. Pets were not allowed on the bus, and when a police officer confiscated a little boy's dog, the child cried until he vomited. He was crying out for his dog, 'Snowball, Snowball.'" And less than a month after Hurricane Katrina hit, the bipartisan PETS Act was introduced to Congress and passed into a law a year later in 2006. And today, we are incredibly fortunate to have three professionals with us who can talk about how the conversation on co-sheltering has evolved since then. There are many lessons to be learned from emergency management because, after all, people who lose their homes due to disaster are homeless. And disaster shelters, while often seen as separate from the homeless shelter system, are still emergency shelters after all. Moreover, as we continue to deal with the repercussions of a warming planet, we will see more and more natural disasters impact our communities, and homelessness as it relates to climate-related disaster rise. The conversation on homelessness, emergency management, and affordable housing are tied together in more ways than one. To talk about the lessons learned and how we can better prepare for the challenges ahead of us, we have with us today Tim PERCIFUL from the ASPCA, Andy Perlman from NYC Emergency Management, and Roxana Petzold from the American Red Cross. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. Speaking first is Tim PERCIFUL. Tim has been the manager of disaster response with the ASPCA since 2018, but has been assisting with animals impacted by disaster for several years now. He's also the current chair for the National Animal Rescue and Sheltering Coalition and on their steering committee for the Best Practices Working Group, which has white papers on how to animal rescue before, during, and after disasters. Tim has responded to multiple types of disasters, including wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, mudslides, and more, both in the fire service and animal rescue. His experience has allowed him to teach across the country with a variety of topics, including emergency animal response, technical large animal rescue, pet first aid, wildland firefighting, swift water rescue, communications, etc. Tim Percival works full-time helping communities, states, and federal partners better prepare for animals impacted by disasters. And okay, thank you for joining us, Tim.
Thank you so much for having me.
When you're ready, feel free to begin anytime.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, animals are impacted by disasters all the time, and you usually hear about it for a little bit, but not for very long. And usually we hear about the people. So there's a whole other side to animals. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to give a couple examples that fairly recent in Hurricane Ida last year. The storm impacted everybody, but it was probably even more devastating to the homeless and people that were on the fringe of being homeless. A lot of people weren't able to evacuate pre-storm. And again, talking about the homeless population or a lot of people in general, would it be possible to do it without certain types of transportation? Were they able to get some of those notification messages on that pre-storm evacuation? Once the storm happened, floodwater made it a challenge to evacuate after the storm with pets. So some rescue organizations would allow pets, some wouldn't. Some of them made it to where they had been contained. Along with that, some of the other challenges that we see a lot with disasters is the fact that there may not be electricity. So again, when we're talking about these vulnerable populations, this might mean that they might not have air conditioning. They may not be able to get news to understand what's going on, and they may not even be able to charge their cell phones. So there's a lot of things that can impact people and pets that a lot of people don't think about. A lot of another issue that we have with certain types of disasters, especially with flooding, is that there's contaminated flood water and contaminated drinking water. So it's not safe to drink the water even out of your tap. So it's not safe to give that to people or the pets. And so that's something that people really need to consider. And again, for those that may be homeless or living outside the home, pretty much everything on the ground is contaminated. Along with this particular hurricane, it was pretty hot, so the temperatures were really, really warm. So people weren't able to get the air conditioning or possibly get out of the heat as needed. Another major issue that we had, and is pretty common during disasters, is that fuel shortages might be taking place. So there are fuel shortages, which may even be more of a problem for, again, those people that might be living out of a car or an RV. So next slide, please. So with this, what happened with Hurricane Ida was there were cohabitated, and I should mention that in the disaster world, we use a little bit different terminology. There's cohabitated shelters, which is where people are staying with pets. And then there's co-located shelters where people are not staying with pets, but the people are able to go and take care of their pets. So there's a couple different terminologies. So with this particular hurricane, there were some cohabitated shelters that took place. And these shelters were at capacity. Everybody wanted to go there with their pets. They didn't want to go to a co-located shelter where they couldn't have their pets. So these places were impacted and became overwhelmed. And what ended up happening with some of these places, not all, but some of these places, they ended up changing their mission, and they ended up transporting people to co-located shelters just because the numbers and the issues that took place with the number of people and the space that available. So with this, people were able to go out into co-located shelters, but I don't have to tell the people that are part of this group, probably the benefits of people being with pets. And then put on top of that, the trauma that people went through with the hurricane. So now people want to be with their pets, may not be able to be, and these people might be individuals, they might be family, they may be children, or even the pets themselves. So there's a lot of challenges that come up with this. So the next slide, please. So this photo is of a person that I personally rescued with our team. She would not evacuate without her pets. She had this dog, Cece, and she had 4 cats. She had a crate for the dog, but not for the cat. So the people that were transporting people out couldn't take her cats and she wouldn't leave. So we happened to be launching boats literally in front of her house to go rescue animals. The photo behind me is from Hurricane Ida. We were launching boats and she came out, waded out in the water and came and found us. And we were able to evacuate her and take her to a co-located shelter with the Red Cross for her needs. So there's a lot of issues that came up with that, and a lot of those are still taking place. You know, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the people that are on the fringe of being homeless or homeless may run into a lot of issues, and this might take a long time. They may even have a home and may have some issues. So they may still be living in damaged homes, like this person here. They might be living in temporary housing somewhere through their insurance or other resources. They may be staying with families and friends, which might be adding some burden on the family and friends, especially if they have pets. And then last I heard, there's still people living in tents in some of the parishes in Hurricane Ida. And the Hurricane Ida happened, I believe it was August last year. So it's been several months. So a lot of these concerns take place over long periods of time. We're still doing recovery efforts after Hurricane Katrina, and that was in 2005. So there's a lot of things that can still be taking place for, again, long periods of time, and especially after the news leaves. So next slide, please. Another disaster that just recently happened was the tornadoes that went across multiple states. It went over 250 miles across multiple states and as multiple tornadoes. We deployed to Kentucky, and our main role there was we were assisting Kentucky Humane with transporting animals out of shelters. And when I say shelters, these were animal shelters to other areas so that they could take in animals that were impacted by the disaster itself. We were also on the ground in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and we were helping them in numerous ways. So next slide, please. In Bowling Green, there were a lot of people that were needing shelters. And when it comes to tornadoes, it may totally demolish, devastate, wipe out a house, and then the house right next door might be perfectly standing, no issues whatsoever. So there were a lot of people that were impacted by these tornadoes. And a lot of these people were in people-only shelters. What happened with their pets was that the pets went to the local humane society, which didn't really have the staff, the space, or anything to put up to take these animals. They made space for them, but it wasn't ideal. And so there was also a cohabitated shelter in Bowling Green, and that that cohabitated shelter was actually in the location where all the donations were coming in. Not all, a lot of donations were coming in. And it was at the same location where people were coming and getting those donations. So these people that were staying in this quote unquote cohabitated shelter, they had no privacy. Their pets had no privacy. People were coming and going 24/7. What ended up happening here was the donation management is a whole other topic, and donations were overwhelming this community with this barn. And so the people that were running the fairgrounds asked the people staying in the cohabitated shelter if they could move elsewhere. So what ended up happening is some of them went to the people only shelter and their animals went to the Humane Society. Some were able to get hotel rooms, but none of them stayed in this location. Now, ideally, the people that were able to get the hotel rooms, they were able to stay with their pets. So that was a really good thing. But there's, to my knowledge, there's still animals at that local Humane Society. And this tornado happened in December. So this is something that lasts a long time. Next slide, please. So I've already talked a little bit about the difference between cohabitated and co-located shelters. So the one that I didn't mention, there's some that are people-only shelters where animals aren't allowed. Then there's animal-only shelters where people aren't allowed. There's different reasons for these. Animal-only shelters are more traditional when it comes to disasters. When your Hurricane Katrina example earlier, those animals went to an animal-only shelter. Co-located shelters are pretty much what most areas are trying to get now, to where people and animals aren't necessarily in the same place, but they're nearby, and the people are able to care for those animals. What we're trying to push is more cohabitated shelters where people are able to stay with their pets. But I also wanted to mention a few special types of shelters, and heating shelters, heating centers, cooling centers. So if the electricity goes out, people can still come and get, out of the heat or out of the cold, maybe for day use only. There's some shelters that provide food and some lounging areas during the day, or they may come in overnight. We just watched a video on domestic violence, and those are types of shelters that take in pets all the time. Same with shelters that take in the homeless. But during disasters, there might be some special needs types of shelters also. Next slide, please. So some of the considerations that you need to have for these types of shelters are keeping people with pets separate from people without pets. That's going to be a big one that you need to look at if you're going to be looking at trying to start a mainly cohabitated shelter. Determine the needs for vaccinations for those pets. Some areas require certain types of vaccinations, so that's going to be something that's going to be needed, and proof of vaccination is good, but what happens if those animals don't have proof of vaccination? Then also being able to keep animals contained. So that might be a crate or a separate room or something like that for people with animals. So that's something else that's going to be really important. Are they staying overnight? So if they're staying overnight, then there's other considerations such as bedding and quiet times and all that you need to have. It's also important that there's an exercise area for dogs, so that the way they have an area to go use the restroom and just exercise outside the shelter. So that's going to be an important part. And is this area fenced or not fenced? What are the rules there? So that's going to be another important thing to do. And then having a room or enclosure so that people can be with their pets is a really good idea. This might allow people to be able to take their dog off leash or take a cat inside of a room and be able to spend some one-on-one time with their pet. So if that's something that you can have, that's a great luxury. But probably one of the most important things is making sure that you have rules for people with pets. And there's all kinds of documents that you can find for that. I can send you some if you want to. You can go to the next slide. If you want to contact me, you can reach out to me at tim.perciful@aspca.org, and I can send you some information on different types of shelters and sheltering and whatever type of information you may need. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation, Tim. And I really love the last slide's image with the cat. It's adorable. And as a reminder to the audience, we'll have a joint Q&A session at the end of all of the session with the speakers, with all of the speakers. So please drop your questions in the chat or hold them until the end. And speaking next is Andy Perlman. Andy has worked at New York City's emergency management since 2016 and serves as a program manager in the Human Services Unit. As an operations liaison, Andy responds to large-scale incidents, maintaining situational awareness between NYC's Emergency Operations Center and field response personnel. Andy also chairs NYC's Animal Planning Task Force, a working group of animal welfare organizations and city agencies that plan for the needs for companion and service animals before, during, and after emergencies. He also chairs NYCEM's Access and Functional Needs Network Working Group, a consortium of disability service providers, governmental and non-governmental agencies, as well as advocate agencies that provide services to individuals with disabilities and others with access and functional needs. Prior to joining NYCEM, Andy was a career firefighter in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia. And there we go. Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, Andy, today. We're looking forward to your presentation. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. The next slide, please. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be covering how New York City Emergency Management plans for emergencies and disasters, and why we include planning for pets and service animals in everything we do. I'll also be covering what the New York City Animal Planning Task Force is and how it supports New Yorkers before, during, and after emergencies. And finally, I'll be covering how pets are included in the city's emergency shelter system. Next slide, please. What's the difference between an emergency and a disaster? It's important to understand this difference because emergency service agencies respond differently to them. For starters, emergencies, as you know, happen all the time with little or no notice. They can be fires, floods, medical emergencies, pretty much anything that happens suddenly without warning, and they can affect small or large numbers of people. Emergencies are handled by local emergency services like police and fire departments, usually without any assistance from neighboring municipalities, and they don't last very long. Disasters, on the other hand, don't happen all the time. Sometimes we get plenty of notice, as with hurricanes and strong storms. Sometimes there's no notice. Although these incidents don't happen very often, they can impact a very large geographical area, a large number of people, where response and recovery efforts go on for a very long time. Next slide, please. These are just a few of the incidents that we plan for at New York City Emergency Management every day. Even with all the complexities of planning for such a variety of incidents across the five boroughs of New York City, where almost 9 million people live, we always take into account that family members include pets and service animals. Next slide, please. What is the Animal Planning Task Force? It's a coalition of animal welfare partners, governmental and non-governmental organizations that plan for people and their pets. New York City Emergency Management is the coordinating agency for this working group. We meet monthly. Before COVID, it was an in-person experience, but for the past 2 years, it's been virtual. If there is an incident that requires activation of the task force partners, we meet more frequently as conditions dictate. We make sure all of the partners are up to date regarding on what each partner's capacity is to respond to emergencies and disasters as they relate to people and their pets and service animals. The partners participate in public education activities to ensure the public knows what is being done to care for pets and their people in the event of an emergency or disaster. What do these organizations do when there is an emergency? Services include animal search and rescue, sheltering, veterinary care, fostering, reunification with their families, adoption, as well as other responsibilities. These partners also provide animal planning subject matter expertise during incidents when the New York City Emergency Operations Center is activated for large-scale emergencies. Next slide, please. The most recent notable incident occurred in the Bronx. It took place on Sunday, January 9th in the late morning. It was a multi-alarm fire in a high-rise apartment building. There were 120 apartments displaced, and unfortunately, there were 17 fatalities. The call for animal assistance was made early. The ASPCA and Animal Care Centers, two of our primary partners in the task force, responded to a reception center that was set up nearby and provided pet food, crates, and other supplies to the residents that were there with their animals. The American Red Cross provided hotel rooms for residents that were displaced, and a large number of them had pets. Fortunately, the hotels accepted them and support was provided at the hotels as well. Veterinary appointments were set up for those animals that required medical attention. And this kind of support is a typical response of our task force partners. Next slide, please. In September of 2017, there was another multi-alarm fire, also in the Bronx. This was notable because multiple pets were rescued by New York City Emergency Management personnel and fire department personnel as well. Next slide. This is from that same Bronx fire. This gives you a pretty good idea of how diverse the pets can be in New York City. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. During this incident, animals requiring vet care were transported to an ASPCA facility. Next slide, please. And ultimately reunited with their families. These were just two of the responses. Unfortunately, there are many, many more that ASPCA and the other partners, along with the Red Cross, respond to. The major takeaway from this, I think, is just how important emergency planning for pets really is in New York City. Next slide, please. Each of our task force response partners has a cache of equipment when they respond out to these incidents. Next slide, please. Animals in the emergency shelter system. We talked a little about how pets are cared for in hotels and reception centers when families are displaced from their homes. During large-scale disasters where hotels just aren't feasible, New York City activates its emergency shelter system. These shelters are typically in schools, which are ideally set up to accommodate large numbers of people. Services provided include a registration area for the Red Cross, meal provision, a dormitory for sleeping, quiet rooms for individuals with disabilities or access and functional needs, plus any reasonable accommodations that might be needed for people. It's very important to note that these emergency shelters are pet friendly. Next slide, please. Why is it important to accommodate pets with their people? We've learned time and time again, as Tim mentioned before, people don't want to evacuate their homes where it might be unsafe and leave their pets behind. We don't want people to have to make those difficult choices. That's why we welcome people and their pets, and of course service animals, in the emergency shelter system. In the shelter, people will typically stay in the school's gymnasium. Pets are housed in a separate room with the owners responsible for their care. Service animals are exempt, of course, from this policy. Individuals with service animals are permitted to keep them in the dormitory area with them and everywhere they go. We've all talked about making go bags in emergency and disaster preparedness. It's always a good idea to make a go bag for pets, just like we do for the rest of the family members. This includes all the things they would need if they're out of the house for several days. If people show up at a shelter with pets without those items, New York City Emergency Management and our task force partners can support them with what they need. Next slide, please. Whenever we open emergency shelters, our logistics team coordinates the delivery of everything that's needed. That includes cots, blankets, durable medical equipment like canes, walkers, and wheelchairs, and many other items. We can support up to 70,000 evacuees for up to 7 days in the shelter system. This includes approximately 6,000 pallets of mass care supplies and emergency goods. As I mentioned before, we also support with pet supplies. It's estimated that there is at least one pet for every 3 households across all 5 boroughs of the city. That's more than 5 million companion animals, including over 4.5 million dogs, cats, and birds. We can support up to 15,000 pets in the emergency shelter system for up to 7 days. And this includes non-traditional pets such as snakes too. With these large numbers of pets potentially going to a shelter with their families, I think you can see the need for emergency managers and their partners to make companion animal needs part of the planning process. Next slide, please. If necessary, standalone animal shelters can be stood up to accommodate large numbers of pets. Our animal planning task force partners are experts at providing the support needed, in addition to providing vet care, fostering services, and reunification with families. As our good friend Roxana Petzold from the American Red Cross says, and she'll be presenting next, Roxana says, if we're not planning for our pets, we are not adequately planning for our people. That's always resonated with me. I hope it resonates with you as well. I hope this gives you at least a basic overview of how New York City Emergency Management plans for its people and pets. Thank you for joining the presentation. Next slide, please. Here is my contact information. If you have any questions that you don't think of during the Q&A session, feel free to reach out to me after the conference closes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. As someone who also lives in New York City now, I'm very honored to have you, sir, and thank you much for your service to our city. And thank you for quoting that beautiful line from Roxana earlier, since she'll be speaking right after you. And that leads to our final presenter for our session today. Presenting next is Roxana Petzold. Roxana is a disaster program manager for the American Red Cross. Based in New York City, she works closely with volunteers, elected officials, schools, animal welfare organizations, VOAEDs, and other community groups to provide information and education on disaster planning and preparedness, home fire prevention, and safe and effective disaster response. In a volunteer role, she has supported disaster evacuees and political refugees in Africa, India, and Sri Lanka. Her love for animals motivated her to respond during Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy to support animal needs, and to later deploy as a member of the ASPCA's FIR team. In response to the number of pets and pet owners impacted by home fires in NYC, in 2018, she was asked to assemble and lead the Companion Animal Task Force for the Red Cross of Greater New York to determine need, identify resources, and develop training for the regional workforce. She currently serves on the National Red Cross Pet Task Force, responsible for building and implementing a national pet program for the organization, and on the New York City Animal Planning Task Force. Roxana continues to deploy nationally during disasters as well. And without further ado,
Yep. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Jesus.
Yes, I can. Please feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for that terrific introduction. And thank you, Andy, for that shout out. And good afternoon, everyone. I am really so thrilled to be here on behalf of the American Red Cross and for this opportunity to share some information about the work that we do throughout the disaster cycle, how we are deepening our commitment to communities by enhancing services to households with pets, and then to share a little bit of information about the allies and partnerships that we've been developing over the last few years. So next slide, please. Most people are aware of the Red Cross, but not really familiar. So I thought I would just give us a little snapshot of the organization. We are the largest humanitarian network. We are adamantly neutral and impartial. We are actually several organizations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. They are usually in the news. You've probably heard about them during military conflicts. They are the keepers of the Geneva Convention. The International Federation, they're the organization that really coordinates international disaster response as well as medical care. And then there are the national societies, of which the American Red Cross is one of them. Next slide, please. So the national societies may have different programs depending on the country, but we all adhere to the 7 basic principles. And our universal mission is to help vulnerable people around the world prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters, armed conflicts, and life-threatening health conditions. So a little snapshot of the American Red Cross. We have 6 programs that we specifically focus on. Probably what we're best known for is disaster response, disaster relief. We also provide planning and preparedness programs where we work very closely with VOADs, other school-based and faith-based organizations, and really any community organization that is interested in these programs. Our blood services program, folks know us for that as well. We provide about 40% of blood product to the nation. We provide training for states, CPR, AED, and then our international services and our services for the armed forces. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd drill down a little bit into disaster response and touch on what Andy was referring to earlier about emergency versus disaster. So we speak about, we sort of look at disasters in two ways, taking into account the scope, the scale, the number of people impacted. Those emergencies that Andy was referring to, we refer to as our blue sky or steady state team. These are smaller in scale. And then our gray sky are the larger scale incidents like the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the earthquakes. The one type of response that we go to probably more than any other, unfortunately, is home fires. Our disaster action team, which is our volunteer-based group, I always want to mention that the Red Cross is a 95%, 95% of our workforce is volunteer-based, and we are volunteers across every level and every function. And what I always feel is the heart and soul of our teams are our disaster action team responders. And these are the volunteers who go out 24/7, 365 to support individuals and families that are going through fires in their home. We get on scene, we identify who the impacted residents are, and we try to determine what their immediate needs are, whether it is everyone accounted for in the family, including pets. Do they need an emergency sheltering situation in New York City? That's typically going to be a hotel for them, and any other needs they may have, including any immediate, medical or disaster mental health needs, we can support with that as well. But fire is the one that we go out to, and as Andy was mentioning earlier, we've seen a really rough year just in the last 8 weeks. Fire has proven to be quite devastating, and Andy can correct me if I've got these numbers wrong, but I think that we are looking at a record number of fatal fires this year. Just this morning, we had another fatal fire where a young woman and a child of 1 year old both passed away. It's very heartbreaking, but part of this is because once a fire starts, you have less than 2 minutes to get out of your home. Another reason, which is especially heartbreaking to me, is we've learned that most of the time fires start because and are allowed to grow as quickly as they do because you have less than 2 minutes to get out, but also because people do not have smoke detectors in their home or their smoke detectors aren't working. And that's just something that we know we can avoid that. Next slide, please. Of course, pets are also impacted by fires. The American Veterinary Medical Association puts this at around 40,000 fatalities, pet fatalities every year. Pets are also injured in fires, they disappeared, and sometimes they're even surrendered because of the loss of home, loss of housing to the individual, or the unexpected financial burden that hits when you've lost everything in your home. Next slide, please. So I know this is where as I mentioned, one of our programs is planning and preparedness, and we also focus on prevention. And I know this is where Tim and Andy are going to go like, okay, here it comes. She's going to make our pitch, and I am. 1-800-RED-CROSS, redcross.org. And I'm going to encourage everybody attending the conference to take advantage of this, our home fire campaign and our annual Sound the Alarm event, which comes up in May, where you can get a free smoke detector and free installation, as well as free education on how to make your home safer and how to keep the whole family safe. All you have to do, share this with friends, colleagues. If you are an organization that does animal adoption, I really want to encourage you to make this part of your adoption program. Reach out to me. I'm happy to send you information. You can slip into the kits. People can call up and register for these smoke detectors. The training, we have really been building on this education so that as we walk through the house with families, we also talk about how to prepare your pets, how to involve them in the fire drill, how to put together pet go bags, and also how to make your home pet proof so that unfortunately your cat has less of a chance of knocking off that wonderful candle that you just discovered, or starting a fire on the stove when they jump up with their paws and inadvertently turn the knobs. So it's a great program, and I really want to, again, encourage everyone to take advantage of it. So next slide, please. So one of the things, you know, people are always surprised to hear how pet-friendly New York City is. And we're a region, the greater New York region for the American Red Cross is about 19 million people and well over 5 million pets. We average about 9 fires a day, 9 incidents a day. And we realized that with those responses, we were seeing quite a number of pets, probably about 5 or 6 pets a week. As Andy mentioned, we see a variety of species as well, and we have seen everything. But we started to think, how can we better support people when we get on scene, when our DAT responders are on scene, and we are seeing families there with a kitty cat stuffed into your coat because you've only got those 2 minutes to run out and you're holding onto your 5-year-old and you've got your kitty. How can we best support those families? So we started to reach out to other animal welfare organizations across the region to understand and get some guidance on working with animals under these kinds of conditions. We built up our pet hotel portfolio to make sure that we had pet-friendly hotels. That's what I'm struggling to get out. We started developing special training for our DAT responders so that they knew how to support families there, to have on hand pet carriers, larger crates, throw those blankets over the crates to help calm down the animal, some leashes. Most people are running out and they don't even have their dog leashed. We'll find them on the street just holding on to the animal, trying to keep the animal contained. We've put together comfort kits. We've been beta testing those. These are just little bags with just some immediate supplies to get families over that initial 24-hour hurdle. We've made sure that internally our teams are aware of all the different services, right up to our disaster mental health team, so that they become aware if a pet was injured or even perished in the fire, they are prepared to have a conversation with that household, with that family. And then, of course, working closely with the Animal Planning Task Force. One of the great things about the task force is the diversity of the members. So yes, there are a lot of animal welfare organizations who are part of that team, but I think this team works so effectively because of the diversity. So there is also us human, us humanitarian, us human focused agencies, but it's the Department of Health, the fire department, the police department, so many other groups, because it turns out we all have a stake in this. And the only way to really problem solve is to come to the table, put those concerns on it, and then begin to troubleshoot and problem solve. One great example is we were concerned about when we encountered families after a fire who lost their pet or whose pet perished in the fire. Through the task force, we were able to work closely with the FDNY and animal care centers to let those agencies know that an animal was missing or had perished. And these agencies are able now to sensitively, tactfully collect the remains of an animal so that we can work with the client and all of us can work together to help the families make a decision on what to do next. And I think that as part of, because we are also thinking about recovery, that makes such an important step in recovery for families to know what has happened to their pet and to be able to move forward with that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pivot here to our gray sky disaster activities. And I guess I want to start by saying over the last 20 years, the Red Cross has seen a steady increase in 2 things: the number of disasters we respond to every year and the number of pets brought into shelters when people are evacuating. That shouldn't come to a surprise to any of us here. We know that roughly more than half the households in the United States have pets. And we know that of those households, just about everybody feels those pets are part of the family. But we are not an animal welfare organization. And what that has meant is that our mass care, and specifically our sheltering teams, is a spontaneous conversion of a congregate shelter for people to a cohabitation shelter, but not necessarily with the supplies or the personnel to support. Next slide, please. So why is this a challenge for the Red Cross shelters? This is a question I hear a lot. Actually, the question I hear is, why does the Red Cross hate animals? I want to say we don't hate animals, but we have a lot of things to take into consideration with congregate shelters, which is the predominant form of sheltering across the country. I'm going to touch on the PETS Act in a bit, but I want to also help us understand how these shelters come into place. Some of the shelters the Red Cross does operate. We kind of own and operate the shelters. Depending on where we are in the country, though, that might not be the case. So, for example, in New York City Emergency Management will stand up the shelter. We may support it, but we are going to follow the guidance of New York City. They're a pet-friendly shelter. But a couple of counties over, they will not allow pets to come in, and we have to try and work within those parameters. It's very tricky. We also have to be aware of the fact that in an open space, we do need to be mindful of all of the people that are there. So if the Smith family has a child who is deathly allergic to cats, we can't put them in the same room. We are also aware that someone may have had a traumatizing incident with a pet. We don't want to add trauma on top of trauma to the people that we are trying to create a safe space for. Next slide, please. Here's a little snapshot of what states have been doing since the PETS law was enacted in 2006. If you take a look at this is actually Michigan State University has a great resource for animal legal and historical information. I encourage everybody to take advantage of all of that great research. You can see in this map that those sort of brownish mustard color states do not yet have any provisions in place since the PETS Act was passed. The dark green have an emergency plan, and then the turquoise, light greenish ones have a law in place and very likely a plan. So you can ask, well, it's a law. Why hasn't something changed? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. We're looking at a very, very diverse and very, very big country with various different economic hardships and people and decisions that are always made at the local level. And these are some tough choices that local jurisdictions have to make. Another reason is the PETS law itself is very, very broad. Basically, to paraphrase it, says you got to do something, but it doesn't prescribe what that something is. So it's taking a little more time for everybody to get up to speed on that. Next slide, please. So where does this leave us? So where do we begin? So our feeling at the Red Cross is we begin before the storm, before the fire, and we all work together. It's really about beginning that planning and preparedness with the whole community involved. Working with those VOADs, identifying local groups, identifying the policy in place at the local jurisdictions is a very grassroots approach, reaching out to those emergency management teams, reaching out to the animal welfare groups, understanding what the needs are, and starting to build on the resources from there. Thinking about locations for shelters. Next slide, please. Thinking about what that interagency collaboration will look like, establishing those regular meetings, thinking about all the different pieces that go into disaster cycle response. So, the planning and preparedness part, the response part, but also post the recovery phase as well. Finding out what veterinarians might be available to support. Dog walkers, groomers. Grooming becomes also a big issue very often, especially with larger emergency responses. Really thinking about who is in your community who might be the appropriate partner in this kind of activity. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then again, keeping that full cycle, disaster cycle in mind as you think about what those successful recovery steps will be, those transition needs. I know I don't have to say to anybody attending this conference about housing and how housing is already a challenge for most of us. After disaster, it becomes even more difficult, affordable housing even more so, and then we add that last layer of pet-friendly housing, and we have a serious challenge. So thinking about what that housing, that transitional housing may look like. engaging mental health professionals, legal counsel, and then also thinking about transportation. This is something that I've come to realize is often forgotten, because while the Stafford Act and the Pets Law says, yes, you can evacuate with your animals, and I can take my 3 cats and my 2 Rottweilers and my bird on that bus with me to get out of Dodge, the reality is when the storm has passed and the green light has lit, and I'm good to go home, I found that my house is actually still in place. I can't get back on that bus with my pets because most public transportation will not allow pets on it. Maybe a small pet in a small container, but there's no way I'm going to be able to get my pets back. And that can become a roadblock, bad pun, for that recovery phase. So thinking about transportation is also super important. Next slide, please. So what have been our key learnings over the last couple of years as we've really been thinking about how to best support the community? So pets are part of the family, and nearly, well, more than half of the American households have a pet. We've got a plan for the whole family, and that's imperative. Collaboration and communication, and I can't stress this enough, before, during, and after. Keeping those lines of communication open when you are in the middle of, whether it's a large scale emergency or a disaster, putting on the calendar for all the relevant teams those meetings to keep everybody in the loop so that everyone understands what the needs are and what the steps will be. Looking at shelter options in a variety of them, congregate sheltering, but we've touched on co-location, which is something the Red Cross is really moving towards because we want to have those pets accessible. We see it as important to the response, but also to the recovery as well. But looking at what that means in your community. Is it possible to stand up an emergency animal shelter that's right alongside where the people are being housed? Looking at different models is such a great idea. Also looking at the different kinds of incidents. We have observed that, sheltering response in areas that are prone to hurricanes, like the Gulf Coast area location, there seems to be a model for sheltering that works there that's different than what we often see in the wildfire area. So understanding what those will look like, what may spontaneously come into action, and how you can support those different kinds of sheltering models. And as Andy was getting, sort of set me up to say, the bottom line is you help the pets and you help the people. And my last slide. This is my last shameless plug for Red Cross resources. We have this wonderful free first aid app. I want to encourage everybody to take advantage of that too. Also online are some guidance for travel, weather, and of course fire. Lots of other great things. So check them out. I really hope you will. And I want to thank everybody for your time.
Thank you, Roxana. That was another fantastic presentation. Okay, I see that Tim already started answering some of the questions and people have started answering each other's questions as well. So I guess that's now we're ready to enter the Q&A portion of our session. As a reminder to our audience, feel free to continue dropping your questions in the chat. In the meantime, I see that someone asked about the Animal Planning Task Force. Does the Animal Planning Task Force have any rule-making authority, or would the group function more as providing gentle nudges to where gaps are found for these sheltering policies?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. The task force does not have any rule-making authority. It's really a collaborative working group of extremely like-minded partners that focuses on planning, preparedness, and response. However, when we do find gaps in any of those areas, New York City Emergency Management, as the coordinating agency, brings all the necessary organizations together, and we provide a forum to discuss possible solutions. As Roxana mentioned, many of the organizations are city agencies like the fire and police departments, health departments, and many others. A good example that I can think of, the most recent example I can think of how we uncovered a gap and provided a solution, Up until a couple of years ago, after a fire, for example, if pet remains were found by the fire department, unfortunately, the remains were taken out to the curb, and that's pretty much where it started and ended, which is a pretty insensitive way of handling the situation. It's terrible for the families to go through this. So what we did collaboratively is we worked with the fire department and had them develop a policy, a protocol that is written into their manual, whereby if any firefighter finds the remains of a deceased animal, they will immediately cover the remains with a tarp. They will contact their incident commander. Incident commander, which is the fire chief, will contact his communications room, who in turn will contact animal care centers, which is the city's vendor for animal response in emergencies. And animal care centers will send responders, take possession of the remains, work with the American Red Cross, who are typically on scene, and reunite the family with the remains, which is a much more humane way of handling a situation like that. As far as rulemaking and advocacy, the U.S. Humane Society is a very strong advocate for proposing and changing legislation regarding companion animal and service animal issues. And they are one of the task force partners as well.
I hope that answered your question somewhat. I also saw that, I think this is a question for Roxana. Someone asked whether their local Red Cross donate pet comfort kits to shelters for survivors that are fleeing that also have pets. Would you be willing to answer that one, please?
Sure. So did I understand the question right? Would the Red Cross donate pet comfort kits to shelters? Was that the question?
I think so, but like the person specifically asked whether their local Red Cross donates. So maybe it's a more regional question as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So so a couple of things. We've been testing out a couple of different ways to support the community. Usually for a large-scale disaster response, we will work with different organizations that will be able to provide those kinds of needs, if it's food, if it's bedding, if it's crates, whatever an animal may need. If that shelter has become a co-located or cohabitated one, some of our partner groups, we may tap the ASPCA or American Humane or HSUS to see if they have supplies, or we may just get those supplies from one of our vendors to bring it there for the shelter. So we can do that. The little comfort kits that I was talking about were something that we use during our DAT responses, which is our day-to-day smaller scale incident responses. We put those kits together because, you know, if there's a fire in the middle of the night, you know, at like 1 o'clock in the morning, as very often there is, and we place people in a hotel, very often we have people out in the middle of like 30-degree weather, which it's been here in New York, standing there in their pajamas. So we provide people with, we have sweats, we have socks, we have shoes. We give them comfort kits, which is just a bag of toiletries for them. And then we've realized that we should be giving something for people with pets too, because, you know, the stores are not, we like to say we're the city that never sleeps, but the truth is stores close. So we want to make sure that there's some food just to, you know, again, just to tide the animals over and the family over until, you know, for that first 24 hours while they're still processing everything that's happened to them. I will say that if anybody, I dropped my email in the chat, and if anybody has any specific questions about the Red Cross and our work, you know, with companion animals and service animals, please feel free to shoot me an email.
Thank you for your wonderful answer, Roxana. And I see that 2 people have asked about the cohabited form of sheltering and how it might work for people who do not have pets themselves. So the next question will be, cohabited shelters are ideal, but it's not very likely that they'll be implemented for a variety of reasons. And for shelters that do use the cohabited model, what's the difference about those shelters or facilities and situations that may allow them to be so. And in that case, how do you balance the positive effects of keeping people with their pets versus the potentially negative effects for people who do not have pets or have allergies or past traumas with animals?
I'll try to take a stab at this one. I think the biggest thing is planning, making sure that you have a plan, and your city, your community, your state, county, whatever it is, has a plan, because that's where these cohabitated shelters are going to take place. They're not something that's is going to easily happen overnight. There's a lot of planning that needs to go into that. So reach out to organizations in your area to see what kind of plans they have for that. There's pluses and minuses to both, or to all types of sheltering. So it's going to depend on what works best for your area.
I'd like to piggyback on what Tim said. Tim, you're 100% right about planning and collaboration. We're very fortunate in New York City to have an excellent relationship with the city's Department of Education. As I mentioned, the shelters, the emergency shelters that we activate are schools. So the Department of Ed knows in advance that people are going to show up with pets. They know in advance that the Animal Planning Task Force partners will come and support them. So for those municipalities that don't have relationships like that, I think that's something that the public and advocate agencies could work together on, and work with their government agencies and other animal welfare organizations and point out how cities like New York can make it work. Of course, we are a resource-rich city, not every city, but we are also very rich in challenges. But as long as the public is working with the private sector, there is a way to have cohabitated shelters.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in too, because I agree with everything that Tim and Andy is saying. And it really starts with planning. And it starts with those conversations, as I was saying earlier, starting to identify, like-minded folk, understanding where those needs are and how to start putting things in motion. There's pros and cons to everything. Schools are a great shelter option because, you have a congregate space. You can put people in the gymnasium. You've got this great space here, but down the hall and around the corner, you've got a room for dogs. You got a room for cats. You got a room for exotics, and you got a back door so people can bring in and out their dog without having to move the animals through the area where people are. So if there are sensitivities, it's not a problem anymore, or you've greatly reduced the problem, I should say. So yeah, thinking about different models, again, thinking about how to approach this from a lot of different ways is how I would encourage people.
Thank you for all of your responses. And since we're talking about cohabited shelters, I think I'll ask this question first from Hillary. How does one plan for pets with difficult behavior issues? Anyone has any advice or thoughts on that matter?
Well, and I can bring up that, and it depends on what you're asking. If it's your own pet, that's going to be, again, you need to prepare for that just like you would with any other animal also. So what are those behavior issues? Do they not get along with people? Do they not get along with animals? Do you need to provide a special crate for them housing certain needs? Maybe they need a comfort item or something. So there's, again, a lot of that's going to be preparation on your own. So when we start talking about, I think Andy mentioned like a go kit. A go kit, having a plan is going to be really important, but in special needs cases like this, it's really going to be important that you're prepared for that. If you're talking about an organization like a shelter that might take in difficult animals, then that would have an area specifically for them, and then try to identify what types of behavior issues might be coming in. It's important to know that different species might have issues with other species, or different animals might have issues with children. So it's really important to think about those things also. Thank
you. That was a very wonderful response. Someone asked about the current housing crisis. Is there a point where the current housing crisis would be considered a disaster or emergency and have its own deployable division with Red Cross in the areas that are most affected?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. I don't think I can really respond to it. I don't really have the information on it, but I can certainly empathize with living again in New York City, where housing has been a crunch forever. It's definitely a challenge. Hopefully, we will not get to that place where the Red Cross is activated to support because we don't have enough housing or enough affordable housing.
Thank you. And following that, the affordable housing crisis we mentioned just now, the climate crisis, emergency management, and the human-animal bond all converge in all three of your works. What kind of cross-disciplinary or integrated interventions do you think would be helpful, whether it be on the policy level, the fieldwork level, or somewhere in between, in all of your opinions?
I'll start with this one too. This is another difficult question. So Roxana mentioned the PETS Act. That was a long time ago. Truthfully, a lot of us in animal welfare, it's so long ago. I think there needs to be some updates to it. So reaching out to your elected officials to see what kind of changes would be really important when it comes to animals. But making sure that your organization and your friends and family are prepared are going to be an important part to that too. I'm not sure if I totally answered that question. That was a difficult question to answer, and I think Andy started to take off his mute, so maybe he can dive more into it.
No, you covered it, Tim. That was a mistake.
Okay, I'll assume we're pretty much good. Personally, today for me, as well as everyone who joined today, today's session felt very meaningful as someone who also had an exotic pet and had to evacuate, have been in a situation where a disaster happened and had to evacuate. And in the end, because I couldn't find the right resources or shelter that will accept me, my partner, and my hedgehog, I had to just stake it out at home. And fortunately, I was lucky enough, but it's thanks to all of your efforts that I feel like people who are in need of shelter in emergency situations are able to survive. And with that, I hate to end this discussion, but we are just about time. And I would like to thank all of our session presenters for being here and for talking to us about your experiences. I know for sure that I certainly learned a lot today, and I'm sure that's the same for everyone who joined us today. Thank you again, and we are very fortunate to have heard of you. And thank you to the audience, all of you. At this time, we'll be entering a 15-minute break after this, and please meet us back in the main Zoom room at 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. Whoops, we still have about 40 seconds left. So if anyone wants to share their contact information or write stuff down from the chat, feel free to do so, I guess.
Yeah, Ella Rack had a question for me. Ella, if you're still on, please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to answer your question about the veterinarians and vet students.
Whoops, I might have missed that one. Thank you.
And I replied to her also. I believe the AVMA has some information on that also, the American Veterinary Medical Association.